the North Sea in the year 793, a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne. Before dawn, a longship slides out of the fog, its dragon-headed prow cutting the water without a sound. Inside, men who have been rowing for 3 days, their hands blistered around oars, their eyes scanning the shore for the glow of candlelight through chapel windows. They do not come to trade. They do not come to negotiate. They come because the monks have gold, and the monks cannot fight back. By the time the sun breaks the horizon, the altar is stripped, the library is ash, and the raiders are gone, leaving only salt spray and silence. That moment is usually taught as the beginning of the Viking Age, a sudden eruption of violence from the northern mists. But the ships that reached Lindisfarne had been crossing the North Sea for generations before that morning, trading furs and amber with coastal settlements, carrying iron and slaves to the markets of Ribe and Birka. The raid was a shift in intention, not in capability. Something had changed inside the minds of the men who rowed those ships. What changed was the pressure of a crumbling world. Scandinavia in the 8th century was not a frozen wasteland of isolated villages alone. It was a world of small kingdoms and smaller chieftains, each ruling a valley or a fjord, each needing to prove power through gifts and feasts. But the soil was thin, the summers were short, and the population was growing beyond what the land could support. Young men with no plot to inherit, no bride price saved, no future waiting for them, began to look not toward the plow, but toward the horizon. The old gods demanded blood and boldness. The new trade routes from the Caliphate were flooding the Baltic with silver, thousands of dirhams stamped with Arabic script, weighing down the purses of merchants on the island of Gotland. A man could gain more in one summer of raiding than in a lifetime of cutting peat and herding goats. And so the longships began to point west, then south, then everywhere. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an act of random violence. It was a calculated reconnaissance. The Northumbrian monks had produced some of the finest illuminated manuscripts in Christendom, books bound in leather and studded with gemstones. The Vikings knew because they had been trading with the continent for decades. They knew where the treasure was kept, how many men guarded it, and that the monks would pray rather than fight. The attack was a business decision executed with military precision, but the reaction to it was something else entirely. Across the Christian world, the news spread like fever through a crowded city. Alcuin of York, writing to the King of Northumbria, saw it as divine punishment for the sins of the kingdom. Never before, he wrote, had such terror appeared in Britain as they now suffered from a pagan race. In that letter, the Vikings became something larger than themselves. They ceased to be raiders from the north and became the instruments of God's wrath in the monastic imagination. They became an apocalyptic symbol that outlasted any single raid, any individual warrior, any ship that ever left a Scandinavian shore. That transformation from traitor to terror is the hinge on which the entire popular image of the Vikings swings. If you want to keep uncovering the real layers beneath the legends, subscribe so you don't miss the next excavation into what history chose to silence. And in the comments, drop one word that you think captures that shift: raider, traitor, or something else entirely. And let's see if the collective mind here can crack the code. By the early 900s, the pattern had hardened. Fleets of 100 ships or more began to assemble along the coasts of Norway and Denmark, no longer aiming for hit-and-run plunder, but for deliberate, sustained conquest. The great heathen army landed in East Anglia in the year 865, led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar himself was a real man or a legend stitched together from older myths, no one can say for certain. The sagas tell one story, the chronicles tell another. What is certain is that over the next 14 years, That army conquered 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only Wessex held, and it held by a thread. And here is where the narrative takes its first turn that most popular histories silently skip. The Vikings did not win because they were superior warriors. They won because the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were fragmented, their armies raised from local levies who had to return home for the harvest season. The Vikings could campaign year-round, feeding their horses on stolen grain, burning fields systematically to starve their enemies into submission. But they were also adaptable. When they faced Alfred of Wessex, a king who rebuilt his army into a standing force, who fortified burhs behind which his people could shelter, the Viking advance stalled. The Treaty of Wedmore in 878 carved out the Danelaw, a vast swath of eastern England where Viking law prevailed. The Norse kings who ruled there began to convert to Christianity within a single generation. They started minting coins with crosses on them. They married Anglo-Saxon noblewomen and wore Frankish tunics under their wool cloaks. The invaders became settlers. The raiders became landlords. And that transformation is the forgotten principle that explains the entire history of the Vikings. They did not only destroy, they adapted, absorbed, and transformed wherever they landed. In Normandy, a Viking chieftain named Rollo knelt before the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911, accepted a grant of land along the Seine, converted to Christianity, and became the Duke of the Normans. His descendants would go on to conquer England in 1066 and the Kingdom of Sicily in the 11th century. They brought Viking ferocity and Frankish administration into a new and devastating synthesis. That ability to reshape identity is the thread that ties this whole story together. And it's exactly the kind of hidden current we follow here. Subscribe to join a community that sees beyond the surface narrative, where every episode peels back another layer of what the textbooks left out. And in the comments, tell me one Viking adaptation that surprised you most. Maybe Rollo's bargain, or something else from the East. The Normans were Vikings who learned to write treaties, build stone castles, administer courts, and collect taxes. They became the most formidable military machine of medieval Europe, but they spoke French and worshipped the same God as the Pope. The blood that ran in their veins was the same blood that had spilled on the sands of Lindisfarne. Meanwhile, the Vikings, who traveled east, carved a different kind of kingdom. Swedish warriors and merchants pushed down the river systems of what is now Russia, founding the first East Slavic state at Novgorod, and later at Kiev. The Rus, as they were called, traded furs, honey, and slaves down the Volga to the markets of the Caliphate, and down the Dnieper to the gates of Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors hired them as the Varangian Guard, an elite force of axe-wielding Norsemen who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. Imagine this. A man born in a turf house on a Norwegian fjord, who had spent his youth raiding Scottish monasteries, ended his career standing in a golden cloak beside the throne of the Roman emperor, swearing loyalty to a man he had never seen before he arrived at the city of 7 hills. That is not the story of simple barbarians. That is the story of a people who could operate across every climate, every culture, every political system on the map of Europe and Asia. If you have ever felt that the history you were taught was incomplete, that something was smoothed over to fit a comfortable narrative, you are right. The Viking Age is usually framed as a wave of violence that washed over Europe for 3 centuries and then receded. But the truth is that the Vikings did not disappear. They became the Normans. They became the Rus. They became the merchants of Dublin and the farmers of Iceland. They became the settlers who reached Greenland and, for a brief window, the shores of North America 500 years before Columbus sailed. Leif Erikson stepped onto the coast of Vinland around the year 1000, somewhere in what is now Newfoundland. The sagas describe grapes, timber, and encounters with indigenous people they called Skraelings. The settlement did not last. The conflicts with the local populations were too costly, the distance from home too vast. But the fact that it happened at all rewrites the geography of the medieval world. The ships that carried Leif across the Atlantic were not primitive boats. They were among the most advanced vessels of their age, built with overlapping planks, flexible enough to survive the open ocean, shallow enough to land on any beach. The Vikings had solved a problem that troubled every other naval power of the time: how to combine speed, range, and seaworthiness into a single hull. Their long ships could cross the North Sea in 3 days. They could carry horses. They could be dragged across portages between rivers. There is a reason the Viking Age exists as a distinct era in history. It is not because the Vikings were uniquely violent. Every civilization of the period was violent. It is because they had a technological advantage that allowed them to project power faster and farther than anyone else, and because the political fragmentation of Europe made them unstoppable until the kingdoms they attacked learned to organize resistance. The conversion to Christianity was the slow death of the Viking world. By the year 1000, the Icelandic Althing had accepted Christianity as the official religion under threat of civil war. The old gods were not defeated by force. They were abandoned because the new religion came with writing, with administration, with alliances to the most powerful courts in Europe. The Vikings were practical people. They followed the gods that worked. The last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, fell at Stamford Bridge in 1066, his Norwegian army shattered by Harold Godwinson's English forces. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror, descendant of the Viking Rollo, landed at Hastings and claimed England for the Normans. In those 2 battles, the entire arc of the Viking Age compressed into a single month. The old world of northern raids ended. The new world of Norman kingdoms began. But here is the detail that lingers. The Viking impact did not end with their conversion or their defeat. It is embedded in the English language. Words like window, knife, egg, sky, and they all come from Old Norse. The legal system of the Danelaw introduced the concept of the jury into English common law. The Thing, the Viking assembly of free men, survives in the names of Scandinavian parliaments today, and in the name of a small island in the Shetlands called Tingwall. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century, are among the greatest literary works of medieval Europe. They describe family feuds, love affairs, legal disputes, and voyages to unknown lands with a psychological realism that would not be matched in European literature for centuries. A saga character does not declare his feelings. He stands up, leaves the room, and rides into the snow. The reader understands everything. And yet, the sagas also conceal as much as they reveal. They were written by Christians looking back at a pagan past they were taught to despise. They sanitized some events, exaggerated others, and invented dialogues for men who had been dead for 300 years. The line between history and legend in the sagas is not a line at all. It is a blur that shifts depending on which scholar you ask. When you walk through a modern city like York or Dublin, the Viking footprint is invisible unless you know where to look. The street names, the buried foundations, the hordes of silver coins dug up by construction crews. The Vikings did not build grand monuments. They built networks. They were not empire builders in the Roman sense. They were connectors, moving goods and genes and ideas across distances that seem impossible for the 9th century. A woman buried in Sweden was found with a ring inscribed in Arabic. A Buddha figurine from northern India was unearthed in a Viking grave on the island of Helgo. A silk fragment from Byzantium ended up in a chieftain's burial in Norway. The Vikings were not isolated in the north. They were the hinge between the Atlantic and the steppe, between the Christian monasteries of Ireland and the Muslim markets of Baghdad. That is the history that gets lost when the story is reduced to axes and helmets with horns. The horns are a myth invented by 19th century opera costume designers. No Viking warrior ever wore horned helmets into battle. They would have been useless in combat and dangerous to the man beside him. But the myth persists because it is more visually striking than the truth. And that is the problem with most popular history. This is exactly the kind of distortion we dismantle here, layer by layer. Subscribe before you drift away. There's more coming that will upend everything you thought you knew about the medieval world. And in the comments, leave one thing you just learned that contradicts what you were taught in school. A single sentence that flips the script. The truth is that the Viking Age ended not because the Vikings were defeated, but because the conditions that made raiding profitable disappeared. The kingdoms of Europe fortified their coasts. The church consolidated its power. The trade routes shifted. The silver from the caliphate stopped flowing. And the young men who once boarded longships for a summer of plunder now boarded ships for a different reason: pilgrimage to Rome or crusade to Jerusalem. The descendants of the raiders became the knights who sacked Constantinople in 1204. They became the merchants who traded in the Hanseatic League. They became the kings who married into every royal house of Europe. The dragon-headed prows were burned or broken up for firewood. The longships rotted in their sheds, and the old gods were sung of only in poetry, their names preserved in the days of the week. Thursday is still named for Thor, Wednesday for Odin, Friday for Frigg. Every time you say the name of a day, you are speaking a fragment of a lost religion that once stretched from the fjords of Norway to the plains of Ukraine. The gods did not die. They were translated into something else. The question that remains open, the loop that no historian can fully close, is what motivated the first generation. What made a farmer on the coast of Norway decide to build a ship, gather a crew of young men with nothing to lose, and row into the unknown with no map, no guarantee of return, and no certainty of what they would find. The silver came later. The glory came later. The first voyage was an act of pure faith in the horizon, and that is the part of the Viking story that still echoes. The willingness to leave the known world behind, to trust the wood and the wind and the pull of the tide. That is not a historical artifact. That is a human impulse that has not changed. If you have ever stood at the edge of a coast and wondered what lies beyond, you already understand the Viking mind better than any textbook can teach.